Yes, Chair, we've received apologies from Councillor Giles Davis and Councillor Cathy Evans.
Thank you. And we move on to item 2, declaration of interests. Anyone declaration of interest at all? No? So we now move on to item agenda 3, the minutes of the last licensing committee, which is item agenda 3. And we go on page 1. Page 2. Page 3. Could somebody move and second this?
Sorry, Chair, you've got an apologies from Councillor Raymond Williams, but I sent in my apologies as well, but it's not recorded. Have it, please. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll double check and update accordingly.
Yeah, that's fine, thanks. Right, so we've moved this now, haven't we?
Yes.
Do you need a show of hands or everything okay? Fine, thank you. So we move on to agenda item 4. That's the minutes of the street trade-in consent hearing held at the Civic Centre, Pontypool. And again, it's page 9, sorry, and 10. Everyone happy with that? Right. So we now move on to item agenda 5, which is the quarterly licensing committee update. And at this stage, I'll ask Alison if Alison will introduce this morning's business. Alison, thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. What we have here is the usual quarterly licensing committee update. This is for the last quarter, and I'm aware that due to snow and other eventualities that we're now somewhat late in making this report to you. There are some things that I'll update, therefore, as I go along, and some things that we will be saving for the next committee. Others won't have anything to say to you on that one. And there are some things that are developing anyway, so it's better if we report all of it to you at the next committee. If we just look at this then, if we start with the alcohol and entertainment on 5.1, we had 13 complaints in the last quarter. And these included changes in ownership of the business, a complaint against the Security Industry Association licensed member of Dorlstaff, noise nuisance, underage drinking, etc. And on those, we've either given advice or actual warnings to the premises concerned. There were 7 representations received in relation to applications for new premises licence, and all of those were resolved following the applicant's agreement to reduce hours applied for or had licensing conditions. There were 32 premises that had not paid their annual fee by the due date. Claire's done very well in chasing those up, and 31 have now paid the outstanding amount following her intervention. 1 licence has been suspended following non-payment, and in fact that premises has been closed for a number of months. In 5.1.4 we explained the investigation into a public house in the area where serious concerns had been identified by the licensing officer, and that was reported to the committee in October. We can update by saying that one had experienced a number of incidents requiring police attendance, and other issues had also been identified during visits by the police and licensing officers. There had been a number of meetings with the GPS and a representative of the licensee, but the progress in dealing with the issues had been fairly limited. There was a meeting then with the licensee in late October where he fully accepted the points and agreed to make a minor variation application so that the agreed conditions could be placed on the premises licence. That process has been completed, and when we wrote this report a few months back, the number of complaints had fallen significantly. However, we had then had one serious complaint over the Christmas period. My understanding is that those premises are currently closed, so we'll be updating fully at the next committee meeting to see what the future of that premises now is, or is likely to be. There was also the licensing officer taking part in an engagement day in the Blaenavon area. That was with the police and a number of other departments within the council. There was iron tracking work done in 3 premises, and high levels of cocaine were found in certain areas of all 3. So all of those have been given advice on drug prevention. There was then an evening of enforcement work and underage test purchasing in the Blaenavon area, and that was following information that sales were being carried out in the off licences, selling persons under the age of 18. Luckily, of the 6 off licences tested, none sold any alcohol to the 14-year-old volunteers, so that was good news in that particular case.
Regarding the underage selling of alcohol, in my ward some years ago, there was a corner shop selling to underage, and when the council tested it, they didn't sell it. So you can only come to the conclusion they sell it to, how can I say, familiar faces. Do you know what I mean? Local people, and it's very, very difficult then to pick it up. I don't know whether it's the case in this, but if people see it happening, local people, they usually know what's happening, you know, what's going on.
One of the concerns is that certain premises only sell to underage people they know. And if you're sending in a police cadet, it can then be very, very difficult. In fact, 2 of our officers are due to go on a training course, a full-day training course just on underage sales, and we're then going to be looking at all of the procedures that we put in place. But at the moment, we've got a very good working relationship with the police, who are putting volunteers in place for us of different ages, so we can test, and it really is all we can do. If they're actually only selling to the people that they know, then it isn't going to work. But we will be reporting at the next meeting on something that just happened on Friday, where in fact we've got a number of sales. So we'll be updating you on that one.
Just before you start again, Alison, do you mind if I think if we went through page by page, and if anyone has questions as we go through on that page, you know, can we ask questions then? Not wait till it's all finished and then have to troll back through.
Yeah.
Everyone happy with that?
Could we not proceed off by urinated armour? Was that the time?
Yeah, we just have to complete. They're both urinates. Yeah.
Yeah. Even down this end, that's better.
Thank you, Alison. If you'd like to continue then, but if members have questions on any of the pages, please ask at the end of that. Thanks.
Yeah. If you want to ask at the end of each session, that might be easiest. Yeah. Okay. We've also been doing work on the Make Safe campaign, which is a Gwent Police initiative to raise awareness in relation to child sexual exploitation. Visits have been made to licensed premises, and posters and beer mats were provided, and I think they have been actually displayed by a number of our licensed premises in the area. As part of that operation, the licensing officer was asked to send information to all hotels, B&Bs and similar accommodation providers, and that's in relation to child sexual exploitation, but also modern day slavery and trafficking, so there's a number of different things going on there. Further training was offered to be provided to the sector. Now, at that stage, we were getting very little support from the hotel sector. but we will be updating you at the next committee because the latest letter that's gone out, we've had a lot more support back from the licensed trade. The reason that this is important is that we are getting information and we know it's happening, that particularly along the M4 corridor and the main routes, that children have been taken into hotels and abused in those hotels. We have had cases of rape reported by underage girls in particular in premises of that nature. So this is something that we're really trying to get to grips with by helping the hotels identify those issues and report them back. And of course then when we look at the the licensing conditions and the main objectives, child's protection is one of those, so this feeds right into that process. The difficulty we have is that some of the hotel premises don't hold alcohol licences, but they are still very keen, some of them, to come on board and to make sure that children are protected on their premises. So moving on to 517, the licensing officer has recently become aware of an increase in antisocial behaviour in the Gymbraen Town Centre, and particularly linked to two premises. One of those is a late night refreshment premise, so the powers that we have only really relate to disorder after 11 p.m. But the other premises is a licensed premises, so we have more control over that one. The police are working with them. I have to say that one of those premises is working very closely with us and very engaged in that process, but the late night takeaway is less engaged, so that's something that we'll report back to as that situation develops. Are there any other queries or questions on the alcohol licensing side?
I've only got one question about the licensing. Whether paying late, is it worth thinking about introducing a late payment fee to save work for yourselves and any of the other officers?
Unfortunately, we're not allowed to.
Right. Just a thought,
We'd love to, but the licensing fees are set by government.
Right.
And the powers that we actually have are fairly limited, because if they don't pay, we can suspend or revoke the licence, but that only really works if they're intending to be there. We do have some premises that are vacant, and there's nobody to collect that money off until the new person comes in. Now, fortunately, most people taking over a premise will wish to keep the existing licence rather than to go through the new licence process. And in order to keep the existing licence, they have to pay any outstanding fees. So we have actually managed to get money back in that way. Yeah.
A bit concerned about these vulnerable children, you say, that are said at the time. What are you doing in schools? Are you letting schools, the teachers, telling the pupils they can confide to tea at the
That would very much be part of the Gwent Police operation, and I know that they're doing a lot of work. They have a unit set up to look after vulnerable people. It's a very big picture, and I think that part of the problem with schools is that it's linked to absences from schools, because mum and dad deliver their child to school, but the child then truants with other adults who are abusing them, and we have had cases reported elsewhere in the country where that's happening. So it's a big picture. It's about children in care, it's about the children at school, but it's also then about the people that we deal with and license being aware of what might be happening on their premises. And for instance, the late night refreshment houses may be used for adults taking children in and rewarding children and saying, well, if you're nice to me through sexual favours, etc., then I'll buy you a meal, or I'll go into an off licence and buy the alcohol that you want. and cigarettes, and I think that this is something that we're getting people to watch out for. Is that, you know, it's a big operation, and even if it's not happening on a licensed premise, they may be the eyes and ears that we need to see what's happening. And a lot of those are coming on board very enthusiastically now. I was dealing with a hearing in Blaen y Gwent this week where, you know, off the record, you know, we were just stood chatting and I was describing this work, and the solicitor for that company was saying, well, as a mother myself, this is something that we'd really want to be involved in and know about, and yes, of course, we'll help out and take part. So I think that this is something that, you know, a lot of the licensed trades are very, you know, keen to become involved in, that they would be seeing somebody older coming in and buying the alcohol for the young person. That's illegal anyway, but also why are they doing it? Is there a bigger story here? So if we move on then to the Hackney and private hire licensing, and this is, you know, obviously for the last quarter up to the end of March, there were 4 taxi-related complaints from members of the public, etc. This was up to Christmas, including a complaint about an attitude towards another driver, inappropriate signage, and interestingly, we did have one that was about the lack of taxis on the taxi rank. And what should have been a busy time, and trying to persuade this person that actually it's a commercial decision on whether taxis are available. But we're dealing with complaints about the fact that, you know, taxis can't get onto the taxi rank. So it was interesting to hear the other side, that there may not be any vehicles there at all. That was Pontypool. Yeah. We had a panel hearing in late October. Our members heard that a young female had been picked up illegally from the taxi rank in Newport and then dropped off and left in a lay-by late at night. It wasn't safe to walk there. It was on the dual carriageway. She had no money and she had no charge left on her phone. She had no way of safely getting home. And then 2 men stopped in a car to pick her up. Luckily, they were SIA accredited doormen who had seen a young girl in danger and stopped to make sure she got home safe. They picked her up and took her to a safe place, and they phoned a relative to come and collect her. So she was lucky that she did get home safely. The taxi driver had his licence suspended for 2 months as a result of this incident, but we're also working with the operator to ensure that taxi drivers are given the correct advice, because he had actually contacted his receptionist to ask what should I do with this girl, and the advice that he was given wasn't good advice. So we're working with them as well to make sure that the information given back to taxi drivers is the right information when they meet a situation such as that. We also dealt with a complaint about a driver vehicle smelling, and that came back to this committee as well for a panel hearing. It was going to come for a panel hearing, but we then had a problem relating to a road traffic incident, which was more serious, and that went directly to the interim chief officer, and that licence was then revoked. So that was dealt with in that way. We also reported at the last committee that we've had a lot of complaints relating to a private hire operator, and we told you that a detailed report was being prepared for submission, and in fact that's still the case. That it's quite a complex case relating to this particular problem, and therefore this is still ongoing. As we mentioned to previous committees, Section 167 of the Equalities Act came into force last year. Just to report that we have now sent out letters to all drivers affected by the legislation, and in fact we have now published the list of wheelchair adapted vehicles as recommended by the Secretary of State. There's been just one complaint concerning disabled taxis in the last quarter, but that didn't fall within the remit of this particular legislation. So in fact, although this legislation was seen as being something that would improve taxi provision for disabled people, in fact we're not getting many applications where we're being asked to use this to resolve issues. Which is good in a way, because I mean, hopefully it means that our taxi trades are compliant with the legislation and actually providing a good service to disabled people. On the subject of disabled people, we've had 2 meetings with the local guide dogs and with Welsh licensing officers, and they're very active at the moment in working with the Welsh licensing officers and also with the Welsh Government in respect of the provision of taxis for the blind or partially sight-impaired people. And they've been explaining that some of the provision for them has not been very good, that taxi drivers in other areas, we've had no local reports, but in other areas have refused to take blind guide dogs for the blind and the assistance dogs. And also that when they get to the other end, then they're just saying, oh, you're here, please get out of the taxi, whereas it's very disorientating for a blind person just to be put in a new place, and that actually the taxi driver needs to get out and point them in the right direction and say the place that you want is just here, or even take them to that place if they, if they can. So what we're talking about is whether taxi drivers need more training. The guide dogs are establishing a best practice guide, which we're discussing across Wales to see whether we should adopt. And they're also talking to the Welsh Government on whether legislation is required in this area.
Sorry, excuse me. Sorry, can I come in? Sorry, Alison, can I ask you to go back to 5.2.4? Talking about number of complaints to the private hire operator. It was reported to committee in October, and you're saying that an update would be for the next committee, but we're already 5 months down the line. Surely if there's a problem with one operator, we can't expect this just to keep carrying on, but if we're already 5 months.
What's happened since then is that a draft report was prepared. Our procedure is that we sent it to the person who was affected by that report, the licence holder, and they were given an opportunity to comment on that. That period that they required to comment was extended. We have now had their full comments back. They were quite extensive in themselves, but I've updated the report. It's been considered on the first informally by the chief officer, who's come back and asked for further clarification, and there's a meeting then next week with Justine to try and finalise that. So I think a lot has happened since October, but that process hasn't been completed yet.
Okay, but I still have concerns that it seems to be taking an awful long time if these complaints are still carrying on.
Can I add a comment in relation to that? There's an awful lot of information to go through to ensure that we are looking at this properly. Alison has spent a long time drafting the report. We need to sit down and make sure that legally it's correct. It would be a large hearing, a lengthy hearing, and we just want to make sure that we're doing everything properly. And that is the reason some of these applications we don't take lightly, and we will take time to consider, because then you will all have, whoever's on the panel, will have the right information to make a decision.
I think it's also worth saying that this isn't perhaps an acute problem so much as a cumulative problem, and it's not like some of the other situations, like the one I've just described, where there was a road traffic accident, there were serious medical issues, it went straight to the chief officer for an immediate decision. It's a very different type of decision that needs to be made. Yeah. Okay, so I think the last item under taxis is 5.2.7, and just to bring you up to date on the Welsh Government's consultation on taxi provision in Wales. As I think we've mentioned before, taxi legislation has been put back to the Welsh Government now as a power for them. The legislation is very outdated, going back to the last century in terms of, the 1800s in terms of the hackney carriages, and they see this as a priority for legislative reform. They finished the first consultation. The second consultation is due on the actual proposals, and we should see that by spring. As soon as we get that information, we'll circulate it to yourselves so you can have a look at that. I think that they're looking at the taxi trade, particularly in terms of the disabled and vulnerable passengers. And that's very important to them. However, they are recognising that the taxi trade should not be meeting the costs of provision for disabled people. They're part of the service delivery, but they shouldn't be asked to pay all of the costs of providing that service. So that's something that's quite a big area of discussion, and that'll be ongoing through the year. Are there any other matters then on the taxi licensing side? Moving then on to the gambling, gaming and lotteries, we haven't had any complaints concerning gambling premises in the last quarter. We have had an issue with an adult gaming centre where the premises was reduced in size but hadn't made the necessary amendments to their licence. Again, that was reported back to you in October, and it still hasn't been resolved because that is currently sitting with the Gambling Commission to make a decision on how to move forwards with that. Although Claire is tracing on a regular basis and trying to get a response from them, we are still awaiting feedback from them on that. The next thing just to mention is that we're working with the housing team and others in terms of local area profiling. And what we're trying to do is identify places which may be visited by vulnerable people and to assess whether the proximity of gambling premises may then be a problem. So that's a work in progress at the moment. That's going to feed into the gambling policy review. We are now starting to review our gambling policy. We have to do this in law, and we have a set timescale that we have to meet. Claire is currently going through the gambling policy with Blaenau Gwent and the rest of the Gwent authorities to see overall what needs to be changed, whether the legislation has changed or the guidance that we have. So they're working together on what the policy should actually look like. Once we have that policy, we're intending to bring it back to yourselves to have a look at. And what we could probably do with doing is delaying the next committee meeting to allow us to complete that process so that we can bring that report to you at the next committee, and that will then allow us a longer public consultation period so that we can carry that out properly if that's an agreement with yourselves.
Could I just ask how often you review this policy? And you said you were reviewing it with Blaenau Gwent and other Gwent authorities. Would that include Monmouthshire?
It will, yes. This is carried out every 3 years by statute, and we would. What we do is we consult with other authorities just to make sure that a lot of what we're doing, where possible, is benchmarked across the area. But there are also bits of that policy that will be local, and that actually feeds straight back into the local area profiling, because this, a lot of what we're doing will be very localised. But we work together with other authorities to make sure that where appropriate, we're working in the same way. But that doesn't mean that this committee doesn't have complete freedom to do things locally, if that is your wish.
Could I just ask, Alison, Do you have any sort of idea how long the delay will be?
I think we were talking. I think that for the end of year reports, that we'd been talking about late April to meet with yourselves. If we can make that mid-May, then we should be in good time to be able to get this information to you. We're not talking much beyond that.
Is everyone happy with that? Thank you.
Okay. If we just kind of have a quick look at some of the other matters then. We've had no complaints or any other work in terms of smoking in enclosed public places. There were no complaints in relation to street trading, and you have just seen the report go through on the panel hearing. It's been very quiet in terms of charity collections and in terms of scrap metal as well. There was just one successful prosecution for a person collecting scrap metal in the Torvine area without the relevant licence. He was fined £300 and he confirmed in court that he has now disposed of the vehicle used for that business. So that was a good result. For animal establishment licensing, there were no complaints in the quarter. We were actually finally managed to resolve the problem of the zoo licence at the Green Meadow Community Farm, and following a lengthy correspondence, they have now received a dispensation from the need for a zoo licence. That was given on the basis that although the animals they have fall within the zoo licensing criteria, in fact they were all either normally farmed in this country or elsewhere in the world, or actually seen as pests. So the need for conservation that's part of zoo licensing was really not seen as relevant in this particular case. And I will say it was deer, it was rhea, which are farmed for meat in certain parts of the world, and small furry, little furry things about the size of a rabbit called daegu, which are actually prohibited from being imported into some countries because they're just regarded as large extra furry rats. So I have to say that DEFRA and others did a lot of work on there and decided that under the circumstances a zoo licence was not required.
You confused me, Nick.
Does it mean?
When you said deer, I thought you meant the zoo licence was expensive.
That as well. That as well. And I think that's the point, is a zoo licence is expensive, even though, because they're to be re-licensed, it'll be over, I think it's 7 years now. It's a lot of the, if it's the full licence, it actually has to be DEFRA vets as part of the inspection team. It is a big area of work, but of course that's aimed at places that have, lions and tigers and really dangerous animals. Whereas Green Meadow Farm has got one deer that's part of the bigger group that was there. They've now got a couple of rhea. The big ostrich-like birds, and as I said, a couple of very furry daegu, which are actually sold in pets at home. So they're not dangerous anyway. They're rather cute if you wish to visit them and have a look. But it's because they were actually given the daegu and kept them as part of the petting, and the small furries for children petting, and the rest are just exhibited as part of the standard farmed animals. What is happening though is because they're also a pet shop, because they sell the rabbits that are bred there, and because they also have a performing animals registration in terms of the animals they take away and exhibit at fates, etc. I'm there annually anyway with a vet, and what we do is we go and look at the animals that would be part of the zoo licence, and that's the undertaking we've given to DEFRA, is that we will be there anyway. A vet will be looking at the animals anyway, so there was no real need for this additional licence. So at least that one is off our desk. I'm glad about that one.
Yeah. Chairman, the question I was going to ask has been answered, really. I mean, it's good that they've had dispensation. And I was going to ask if you had any idea how much the licence would have cost them, but you've said it's very expensive, so, yeah.
Because they were seen as a small zoo with the derogation, I think I was charging them, okay, from memory, about £500. But that is for a 7-year licence. For a full licence, we'd be talking 1,000 and up. It is a big operation. But then if you look at someone like Bristol Zoo or somewhere like that, it's a drop in the ocean when you actually look at the costs of running the premises. I mean, £1,000 is probably what the lion eats in meat in a couple of months. So it's only a small part of the operation. But for someone like Green Meadow Farm, it was a big ticket item, and for ourselves as well. That was a lot of work for me. And also in terms of the responding to freedom of information requests and all of the other ancillary work that when they were there we were having to do without making a charge. It all helps. Okay, so just moving on then to the rest of that, just on the service requests, there were 59 service requests in the court up to Christmas, and 8 of those were freedom of information requests. 3 related to driver convictions, and then others for taxi vehicles, the Equality Act and zoos. We do get quite a few freedom of information requests on zoos and on dangerous wild animals. There are some charities out there that collate information across the UK on an annual basis. And I think the GPS convictions one is interesting because we do have quite a few organisations out there that are concerned about our convictions policy, and that's something that we're just getting more information about now following an audit of the convictions policy in Monmouth, and there are also changes being proposed by the Institute of Licensing, so that may be something we come back to you on. But the worry is that we have drivers who have been convicted of crimes and maybe even of a sexual nature. And a lot of the people who are making those freedom of information requests don't really realise that the convictions for crimes of sexual nature are much more than just things that might be dangerous to the people using those taxis. And the one that I've heard is a conviction, I believe this was in Blaenau Gwent, where there was a conviction of a sexual nature, and it transpired that as a young lad he'd gotten very drunk and had accepted a dare to run around the pub naked, for which he was prosecuted, but it wasn't necessarily seen as something that was endangering the young vulnerable people using the taxi 30 years later. But I think also what they don't realise is the reason that we don't necessarily deal with these onto our convictions policy is that we can bring things to yourselves for a panel hearing, and you will have considered things long before they get to conviction. And that we would be bringing that information to you for consideration as a fit and proper person, even where there isn't necessarily a conviction. So I think that there is this misunderstanding that the convictions policy is what's protecting people, and in fact it's actually our powers are much stronger than that. Okay, so moving on to management matters. I think matters in terms of the Constitution are still ongoing, and some of the changes that we're looking at on that. In terms of the policies, I'm going to cover that in the next report. And in terms of fees, we are still looking at that with a lot of the fees coming, hoping to be changed as necessary and to come back to you for scrutiny as appropriate. The Immigration Act, we've reported that the UK Visas and Immigration Service became a responsible authority under the Licensing Act, and there have now been operations put in place. And in fact, one of the panel hearings that you are due to hear will be a result of those actions. So we will be doing a lot more reporting in future in terms of some of the work that they're doing. Looking at the collaboration, that's continuing, and I think continuing to work well in terms of giving each other support where we need to. There have been no complaints against service in the quarter leading up to Christmas. And in terms of the licensing team performance, the activity report is attached as Appendix A, with quite a few complaints being dealt with in that quarter. The team were very busy just before Christmas, but they're working at the moment to remedy any backlog in inspections. So they're out and about at the moment, and I'm hoping that when I make the report to you, hopefully what will be now be in the May meeting, that we'll be able to report back and say that, you know, we have gotten very close to achieving targets if we're not actually there. So that is the end of that report. If you have any queries or questions.
Just looking at page 21, visits re non-payment of annual fees. I know that you mentioned it earlier, but it's increased dramatically, shall we say, in quarter three. Is that because all fees are due in quarter three, or all fees are due in quarter two, or?
These were visits being made, and in quarter one would have been, you know, as the bills were being sent out and recalculated, etc. And it's when we send out reminder letters, we do things like that. And then when that doesn't work in quarter three, Claire is out pounding the pavements, knocking on doors. So that in quarter three, as I said, she made a couple of visits in quarter one and two, but by quarter three, when other work had failed, then she's out knocking on doors.
Nobody enclosed smoking, and yet we seem to have 82 inspections. Is there any particular reason why that's high?
I think what we do is we do a lot of inspections in relation to other work. So it's integrated. So, for instance, every time we go to a licensed premise, unless we're going there for a specific reason, and that takes precedence. Anything that's general, we'd also look at smoking while we're there. So we'll walk in, we're looking for the notice by the door, but also looking for the no smoking signage by the door.
Thank you, Alison, for that comprehensive report. It's very good. Thanks very much. We move on to item 6, Licence Policy Committee Update. That's page 29 to 42.
Well, thank you. This licensing policy report follows on from previous discussions that we've had on 5 of our licensing policies, and those are the taxi, Hackney and Hackney private hire, street trading, scrap metal, charity collections and sex establishments. What I'm proposing to do is to go through each of those with you and to report back on the public consultation that took place. And what I'll do is for each of those, if you don't mind, I'll then ask you what you want to do to move it forward, rather than kind of discuss all of them at the end, where I think it can get very confusing then. But we'll talk about each one and resolve each one as we go through. Okay. So if I just report then on the consultation that took place. As I've said, we did an initial public consultation across Blaenau Gwent and Torfaen. And I've attached the executive summaries that we put on there. Rather than put all of the policy proposals on the website in English and Welsh, what we did was we just put an executive summary on there, so that people knew roughly what we were talking about and can come back to us and to ask for more information if they needed to. the initial consultation didn't specify what we were, anything that we were specifically looking at, and that's because of the case law that's now arising in terms of consultation, which actually says that we should seek views before we actually determine what we're thinking about, so that the public and businesses have a blank piece of paper where they can make any comments that they want, rather than being told, that's what we're thinking about, do you agree or disagree? So that was the reason for leaving it very, very general. We also looked at how widely we needed to consult, because the recent case law emphasises the need to be inclusive of anybody that could be affected by the policy changes. The issue that we then have is that anybody across the EU in particular is entitled to apply for a licence, and that is enshrined within the Services Directive. And of course anybody can anyway if they want to operate in this area. And that also anybody from across the world could be visiting this area, and particularly the World Heritage Site up in Blaenavon. We could have people across the world, visiting there and visiting our, premises and using taxis and doing things like that. So we had to be as wide as, get this as widely as we could, but within a reasonable cost, because we can't talk to everybody personally. So what we did was we publicised in the papers where we could, but they didn't really pick that up. But we also used Facebook and social media and anything else that we could to get it out there. We didn't get a lot of response. We got 6 responses in total, which are attached as Appendix 2. And you can have a look at those and see what you think. But I think a lot of them were fairly specific about, one of them I think was actually saying, well, we shouldn't really have policies, this is just, a lot of work and a lot of complication for the businesses concerned. I'll go through that in more detail as we go through. I think the licensing policies are important because they set out the requirements and conditions that can be applied to any licence. So they set out the framework that we can then apply when considering applications, and you can then apply when considering any appeals or queries. They're specifically important where legislation doesn't specify requirements and conditions, and I think that's the case in point for that would be the taxi licensing, where actually most of the work that we do to set the standards for our taxi trade is done here as part of our licensing policy. So, looking at what we can do with these, there are 3 main options, which is leaving things as they are, or carrying out reviews of existing policies, and also we can develop new policies where we don't have them already. Just to bear in mind that any review or development of policies will require extensive consultation, and as a minimum 3 months for local communities and businesses to comment. As before, efforts would also need to be made to include businesses and business users regionally and wider, where they could be impacted by what we're doing. So looking specifically at the taxi licensing, I would say this is the main policy under review in terms of licence numbers and their impact on the local communities. And the majority of the policy that we have in place has remained unchanged since 2015, although we have updated things in terms of the knowledge test and the intended use policy. No significant matters falling within the remit of the policy were raised via the consultation responses, or have been raised by officers for the last review of this policy. 2 matters have been raised by a licence holder as part of a licence application that you might like to take into account. And the first is whether it's reasonable to only licence vehicles that are under 10 years of age. And you'll be aware that in the 2015 policy we increased the age of vehicles from 8 to 10. And whether it's only reasonable to consider exemptions in respect of, say, mechanical tail lifts rather than manual tail lifts or other means of getting disabled persons into a taxi. As I've mentioned before today, taxi licensing is in the process of being devolved to the Welsh Government. And given the outdated legislation and the new challenges facing the licensing industry, has been identified as a priority for legislative review. An initial consultation has been concluded and the results are expected shortly. But I think that what we're looking at is that new legislation, or at the very least statutory guidance, is expected within the next 12 to 18 months. And what this would mean is that any policy changes that we make now could be overtaken by changes in the law or in statutory guidance that we have to take into account, and we'd have to do that process again. So it's going to be a case of you considering whether there are urgent matters that necessitate a policy review sooner than the likely timescale for legislative change, or whether there are no urgent matters and the policy can therefore review can be delayed until any legislative matters can be considered.
In view of the proposed changes that could happen with the legislation, I think it would be prudent to keep our changes to a bare minimum at the moment.
Given that these changes were dealt with in 2015, it's not exactly a long time ago, is it? So my view is I don't think there's anything urgent that we need to do.
That's what I would propose.
Chairman, I'd agree with what's been said. I mean, 12 months isn't a long time, is it, to put one policy in and then maybe having them changed later. I'd leave it as it is, as my colleagues have suggested.
And if I could just add, that was very much the view of the Blaenau Gwent committee as well, and that their decision was to review this again after the Welsh Government have done whatever they need to do. And of course then it does save us time doing it both together. It doesn't mean that we won't do it for yourselves if you see the need, but it would be a lot less work for us to leave this now and to wait and see what happens with the Welsh Government review. Just because you want to record that decision now, or do you want to record it at the end?
Is everyone in favour of... yeah? Thank you, Alison.
Thank you. Then if we move on then to street trading, and this policy has remained unchanged since 2009. No significant matters were falling within the remit of the authority were raised via the consultation response. There was some comment about the use of land and whether the council should facilitate that, but that wouldn't be within this policy. Officers haven't identified any matters at the moment that require review that we can't deal with within the existing policy. Just to confirm that Blaenau Gwent, there's more of an issue over there with car sales, but we're looking at whether we can resolve those working into conjunction with the civil parking powers that all Gwent authorities are in the process of adopting at the moment, with the police stepping back from that. And they've therefore decided to put the review of the policy on hold until that matter can be addressed. So again, it's just going to be a case of whether there are any urgent matters that you feel necessitate a policy review, whether there are no urgent matters at this time.
Everyone happy with just to go along with what Alison said?
Yes.
Everyone happy?
Yes.
That's fine.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, looking at scrap metal. This policy has remained unchanged since the introduction of the new legislation in 2013. No significant matters falling to the remit of the authority were raised via the consultation responses or have been raised by licence applicants or holders. I think that the matters under consideration by officers for review, which includes a requirement that licence holders provide any required records within a specified reasonable timescale. And this would help to ensure effective enforcement and reduce the time spent by officers in seeking this information. That's regarded as relatively non-controversial and shouldn't therefore require too much time for us to achieve. However, on discussion with that, about that with the officer concerned, what we are looking at the moment is to look and say whether we could suspend or revoke a licence if those people don't come back to us with the necessary information that we've requested to ensure compliance. So I think that's something at the moment that we are doing a bit more work on, and it may be that we need to revisit that and come back to yourselves if we can't use those powers. On the basis of that, and there were no problems identified in Blaenau Gwent, and they've therefore agreed that this just be kept on to review at this moment, but the review isn't taken forward.
Everyone agree with that?
Yes.
Yes?
Yeah.
Thank you.
In terms of charity collections, which covers street and house collections, this doesn't actually cover a number of the national charities who are exempt from the need to apply to us for a licence, or collections in private places such as inside a shop. We don't have a charity collection policy in place at the moment, although we do use a set of informally adopted guidelines which we use to determine which charity collections should be permitted and to make sure that there aren't too many in one place at one time, and also which feed into our restrictions on people going round house to house, knocking on doors, etc., which can sometimes be linked to people selling things, etc. What we're suggesting, however, is that the development of a policy would formalise the existing arrangements, make these more visible to those applying to us for a charity collection and to the public who might be affected by these, and would also allow a more effective complaint and appeal procedure. Nothing was raised via the consultation response on this, and has been raised by licence holders or applicants since the last review of this policy. The decision of Blaenau Gwent is that it would actually be a good idea to have some form of policy in place, as we don't have one, and that should then be included in the work programme for the coming year.
Sorry, can I come in there? Alison, can I ask you to clarify something? We have a number of no-code calling zones in Torvine now, and I've been approached by a number of residents saying, does that apply to charity collections, people knocking on your door asking for money or not? Because that does seem to be a grey area.
I think it is a grey area. I think it's something that we've been looking to discourage collections in those areas. One of the problems we have is that the national charities don't need to apply to us. Okay, so the bigger charities wouldn't need permission, but I would suggest that the bigger charities are perhaps not the ones we necessarily would wish to control. And I think it's some of the smaller ones that, there are some grey areas where they're using that to gain access to premises, and then and we have had one, for instance, in the Pontypool area, where they said, well, they weren't actually a charity collection because they were selling the leaflets. There is a grey area there, and I think by having a policy, it allows us to have that discussion, and it allows us to, to really determine, and to modernise our thinking on it, make it clearer to those wishing to apply for a licence what isn't allowed and where, and also for members of the public who are concerned, they've actually got something they can read through and they know what their rights are as well.
Yeah, just to come back on that, my area is a calling control zone, and it does annoy me that charities come round knocking the doors. One, because you're hearing so many stories now about the elderly people with so many, giving to so many charities because they find it difficult to say no. And you've got other things in that it's okay, anybody can fake a badge and go knocking on people's doors and then go around burglaring later on. So I've got some severe concerns with charity collections. So I think we do need a policy on this.
It is worrying when they knock on people's doors and they want people to sign to have, direct debit or whatever, standing order, and it's difficult for people to say no, as you said, there are lots of good charities. They just don't want a one-off. They want it extended, forevermore until the person, stops it. That's a very worrying thing. And another thing I've encountered in some shops, the larger shops, you go in, I won't mention any, but there's some in Cwmbran. You go in and there are people by the door with a little stand and they want you to sign something for a direct debit and things like that. And it can be annoying when you're in a bit of a hurry. But, we've got no control over that because it's the shop has given them permission to do it. But it's still targeting vulnerable people.
That's something, if it's in the public place, it is very difficult. But if it's inside the shop, it's seen as not so much. I would say that we work very well with Cwmbran Town Centre, and they're very proactive in working with us in making sure that the charities that are out there are known. And of course, the other big issue is that if they apply to us for a licence, we can check who they are and check that they're actually a charity. And we can actually start to look at, how much of the charitable collection will go to the charity in question. And I think that that's all information that, if the law allows us to look at that, then I think we should be doing so. And I certainly think that, having a look at what we're doing at the moment in developing a policy that's publicly discussed, I think it would be very valuable.
And just a quickie there, on top of that, there are times when they do house to house that they are allowed to call, and I believe it's up to 7 or 7:30 in the evening. That's great in the summer. In the winter, it's as black as a rat, especially with our new lovely lighting policy where half the poles are out, and you've got people wandering around in the dark. All right, it's only about 6 or 7 o'clock, but in January, in December and January, it's really dark, and so I think,
I think vulnerable people in particular feel concerned about answering the door in the dark.
So can I just show that we all agree with that?
Okay, so moving on to the issue that normally raises eyebrows, which is sex establishments. Covering sex shops, sex cinemas and sex entertainment venues. There are no licences in place at the moment and we get very few applications. One consultation response spoke against the premises of this nature in general, but I think it's important to note that local authorities are not permitted to institute an outright ban. And we have to consider each one on its merits. However, we can introduce measures to protect local communities. Now, as part of the legislative adoption process, we adopted licensing conditions, and those included things like requiring sex shops to have darkened windows that people could not see the goods on sale, and matters such as that. And we're not proposing at this stage to go through the legal process necessary to change these, which would be considerable. Instead, what we're looking at is that any policy would provide information on how the conditions would work in practice, that inform residents, etc., how they could have a voice in any decision. There are no current issues necessitating the development of a policy, but The likely controversy surrounding any application makes it sensible for us to have a clear idea of what we're doing, why, when and how now, before we get the application, rather than trying to develop those issues once the application is received. I would say that we may well get a sex shop application, but in fact most is now done via the internet. And I would suggest that there are actually going to be fewer sex shops in existence rather than more, although we do have some shops that may then apply for a small area that sells goods of this nature. I think again sex cinemas we're unlikely to get anything because you can get anything you need now on the internet. You can just download for the viewing in the comfort of your own home. And the sex entertainment venues, there are very few of those, but they're the controversial ones. And if Rhino or one of the other big companies decide that they want to set up a lap dancing club in the Torvine area where we have, a good road network that, we can get people in from a wide area, it could happen, and that would be highly controversial. And I would like to, for us to consider how we would deal with that and the process that we put in place to consider such an application at this stage.
Can I say, because I know we did have an application a number of years ago, because I was on that panel, although I did query why I was asked to be on that panel, but if I remember correctly, it was quite difficult to decide because there wasn't a policy in place, and therefore we had to treat it as a one-off. But so I think we do need a policy, so if it does come up in the future.
Members, I was at the same hearing as Councillor Mills. Actually, they put a very, very good application in, and they spent a long time consulting with the licensing department to ensure that they did everything correctly. There are very few grounds in which to refuse. The way the law is set out, you have to have conviction of a certain kind. I can't remember the exact legalities of it, but because of the legislation, it makes it very difficult to refuse them. But a policy would assist, and also it would show applicants and members of the public what the grounds of the rules are. Thank you, Chair.
Basically, you're asking us if we would like to have a policy made for this against this sort of information.
What the policy would do would set out, the guidelines for how to consider it. And I think, as has just been said, that the last one. The last policy, the last application consulted very well, and I think that's one of the things we'd like to see, is to make sure they consult very well and that everybody has an opportunity so that they have a voice in that process. And I think that's the kind of thing we can't say no, but we can say what we expect to see to make sure that that decision is made properly. And that was very much the decision of your colleagues over in Blaenau Gwent, and they've asked for this to be included in their work programme for the coming year.
So we basically all agree that there should be a policy, or we deal with it.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Well, so I think that's just about it in terms of the report. I think we've gone through and identified that the 3 existing policies will not be reviewed at this time. Although obviously, if there are any other changes, if anything happens, then I would bring that back to yourselves for further consideration. And that over the next year we'll begin the work needed to develop the 2 new policies on charity collections and on sex establishments. Thank you. I think that it'll be mid-May now. We'll miss the bank holiday and get it in just after that. I think if we could have a look at room and officer availability first, if that's okay with you. I believe so, yes. I believe we all can, yes.
Chair, can I just say that we've got the council AGM towards the end of May. In fact, looking at the diary, it's on the 15th. Just whether you wanted the meeting to take place before annual council or after. If it's after, if we have any new members on the committee, I think training would need to take place before they look at that. So just wanted to sort of flag that up with you.
If I could, what I'll do is I'll go back and have a look at what our programme is for developing the draft policy for you to look at, and how short a period of time Chris thinks he needs to get that to you for consideration before the meeting. And we will then decide when the earliest date is that we can have that meeting, and then look at things like the AGM and other matters. But I'll take that on advisement with yourselves on when the best time is to fit that in.
There's item 8, exclusion of the press and public. I'd like to ask Justine if she would make this announcement. Thank you.
Members, this is an exempt item now, and therefore the webcast will stop because it is exempt. I would like to state that we have powers to do this in paragraphs 12 of Part 4, Schedule 12A of the Local Government Act 1972, as amended by the Access to Information Variation Order Wales 2007. And this is because it contains personal information. Thank you.